I want to say, my son Richard has always had a generous heart.
Sometimes too generous.
He has a habit of seeing the best in people, even people who don't entirely deserve it yet. I pray Amanda grows into the kind of wife worthy of him. It takes time, you know, for some women.
My own wedding, and not one word from the man I just married.
It's sweet that you drew your mother like that, Sophia. I'm not sure how much longer that picture stays accurate.
Excuse me? What exactly are you telling my daughter right now?
Mother, that is enough. That has always been enough. And I have let it go on far too long.
Richard, I only meant...
I know exactly what you meant. You've meant it for 9 years.
Amanda Bassey met Richard Coker the ordinary way most young professionals in Lagos meet, through a mutual friend's dinner party. The kind of low-key gathering where nobody expects to leave with anything more than a good meal and pleasant conversation. Amanda, 26 at the time, worked as a marketing associate at a growing fintech startup. Richard, 29, was an engineer with a steady, quietly ambitious career trajectory and an easy, gentle warmth that Amanda found herself thinking about for days after that first dinner. Their courtship unfolded over 18 unhurried months, long conversations that stretched past midnight, weekend trips to Calabar and Abuja, the slow, comfortable accumulation of inside jokes and shared routines that mark a relationship settling into something real. By the time Richard proposed, on a quiet evening at his family's favorite restaurant in Victoria Island, Amanda had no doubts left. She said yes before he'd even finished getting fully down on one knee. What Amanda did not yet fully understand, what she would only come to understand slowly, painfully over the following 9 years, was that marrying Richard meant inheriting his mother, Mrs. Patience Coker, a formidable widow who had raised her only son largely alone after her husband's early death, and who had, in the process, built an emotional world in which Richard's devotion to her was meant to remain permanently, unquestionably first.
Take a deep breath. You look absolutely beautiful. You will be fine. She will love you.
Welcome to our home. Thank you so much.
Amanda's introduction to Mrs. Coker came during the traditional family visit a few months before the wedding, the formal occasion where both families meet to discuss the union properly. Amanda arrived nervous but hopeful, dressed carefully, bringing a thoughtful gift she'd spent weeks selecting. Mrs. Coker greeted her with a smile that Amanda would later recognize as one of the woman's most dangerous weapons, warm enough to fool an entire room, cold enough underneath to make Amanda's stomach tighten without her fully understanding why. "So, this is the girl," Mrs. Coker said, looking Amanda over with a slow, assessing gaze that felt less like a welcome and more like an inspection. "Richard has told me so much about you. I only hope you understand what a special man you are marrying. His father, God rest him, always said Richard would need a wife who understood her place." Amanda, eager to make a good impression, laughed it off as old-fashioned humor, the kind of comment an older woman from a different generation might make without any real edge behind it. Richard, sitting beside her, had shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, a pattern Amanda would eventually learn that would define the shape of their entire marriage for years to come. The comment continued throughout the visit, small and precise, each one landing just soft enough to dismiss individually while accumulating into something harder to ignore.
A remark about Amanda's career being a nice hobby until the children come. A pointed question about whether Amanda's family could really afford to contribute properly to the wedding. A comparison delivered with a sweet smile to a family friend's daughter who had given up her whole career to focus on her husband the way a real wife should. Amanda left that first visit unsettled, but not yet alarmed, the particular unease of sensing something is wrong without having enough evidence to name it clearly. That unease deepened over the following months of wedding planning, during which Mrs. Coker inserted herself into nearly every decision, overriding Amanda's choice of wedding colors in favor of her own preference, insisting on inviting an extensive list of her own church friends that nearly doubled the guest count and strained Amanda's family's contribution to the budget, and in one particularly telling moment, suggesting to the tailor within Amanda's hearing that the wedding dress be altered to be a little less form-fitting. We don't want people getting the wrong impression of the kind of bride Richard is marrying. Amanda's own mother, more experienced in reading the particular currents of family politics, had gently warned her during this period. Some mothers hand over their sons with an open hand, she told Amanda one evening. Others hand them over with a fist that never fully opens. I am not yet certain which kind you have found, but be watchful, my daughter. Amanda, deeply in love and eager to believe the best of the family she was joining, chose at the time to interpret her mother's warning as an older generation's natural caution rather than a genuine premonition, a choice she would look back on in later years with a complicated mixture of understanding and regret. The full shape of what Amanda had married into revealed itself completely on her own wedding day. The ceremony itself, held at a beautiful garden venue in Lekki, had proceeded without incident. Vows exchanged, tears shed, the particular joy of two families formally becoming one. It was during the reception, during the traditional toasts, that Mrs. Coker took the microphone for what everyone assumed would be a loving mother of the groom speech. I want to say, Mrs. Coker began, her voice carrying warmly across the 200 assembled guests, that my son Richard has always had a generous heart, sometimes too generous if I'm honest. He has a habit of seeing the best in people, even people who perhaps don't entirely deserve it yet. I pray Amanda grows into the kind of wife worthy of him. It takes time, for some women to truly learn how to properly support a good man. The words landed like a slap disguised as a blessing. A ripple of uncomfortable silence moved through the crowd, guests exchanging uneasy glances, unsure whether they truly heard what they thought they had heard. Amanda sat frozen at the head table in her wedding dress, her face burning, forcing a smile so the 200 guests watching her wouldn't see exactly how deeply the words had caught her. Richard, when Amanda finally caught his eye, gave her an apologetic look but said nothing, made no correction, offered no defense. He simply reached for her hand under the table and squeezed her, as though physical comfort could substitute for the public defense his new wife actually needed in that moment. It was, Amanda would realize only years later, the first of hundreds of times Richard would choose silence over confrontation with his mother, a pattern that would cost their marriage far more than either of them understood on that wedding day.
The years that followed Amanda and Richard's wedding settled into a painful, exhausting rhythm. Mrs. Coker's cruelty, rarely dramatic enough for any single incident to constitute a clean, decisive breaking point, but relentless enough, accumulated over time to grind down even Amanda's considerable resilience. Mrs. Coker criticized Amanda's cooking at every family gathering, comparing it unfavorably to dishes she claimed Richard's ex-girlfriend Funke had once prepared. A woman Amanda later learned Richard had dated only briefly in university, elevated by Mrs. Coker into a permanent mythical standard of comparison designed purely to keep Amanda feeling perpetually inadequate. She undermined Amanda's parenting when their daughter, Sophia, was born, insisting on outdated methods, overriding Amanda's decisions in front of the child, and once, devastatingly, telling 3-year-old Sophia directly that mommy doesn't always know best, but grandma does. A comment Amanda overheard by accident and never fully recovered from. She spread quiet, corrosive rumors within the extended family and church community, suggesting, without ever stating outright, that Amanda was cold, difficult, perhaps even unfaithful, planting seeds of doubt that Amanda would occasionally catch surfacing in the careful, too polite way certain relatives began treating her at family functions. Perhaps, most painfully, Mrs. Coker made repeated, increasingly subtle attempts to introduce Richard to other women, inviting eligible young women from her church to family events, praising their virtues pointedly in front of both Richard and Amanda, once even suggesting during a period when Amanda and Richard were going through a difficult stretch after a miscarriage that perhaps this marriage was never truly blessed, Richard. Perhaps you should consider what else might be out there for you. Through all of it, Richard remained largely passive, occasionally offering Amanda private apologies and reassurances, but almost never confronting his mother directly, always finding reasons why now isn't the right time, or she's just set in her ways, she doesn't really mean it like that. There were smaller cruelties too, easy to overlook individually, but corrosive in their accumulation. Mrs. Coker forgetting to invite Amanda's parents to family celebrations while ensuring Richard's extended family was always well represented. Commenting pointedly on Amanda's weight after each of her 2 pregnancies. Once returning a thoughtful birthday gift Amanda had carefully selected with the flat observation that I already have enough clutter in my house, but thank you for trying. She had a particular skill for delivering these comments in front of witnesses, always with a smile warm enough that anyone objecting risked looking unreasonably sensitive rather than just justifiably hurt. Amanda's own mother, visiting from Ibadan one Christmas, witnessed one such exchange firsthand and pulled her daughter aside afterward, visibly troubled. That woman is testing how much you will tolerate, Amanda. The more she absorbs without pushing back, the more she will take. I raised you to have more fight in you than this. I have fight in me, Mama, Amanda replied, exhausted. I just don't know how to fight a war Richard refuses to acknowledge is even happening. Amanda considered leaving the marriage more than once during those years, not because of anything Richard himself had done, but because of the exhausting, ongoing war his mother waged against her peace, year after year, with no end in sight. What kept her there, she would later admit honestly to herself, was not naivety, but a genuine, complicated love for Richard himself, a man who was, in every dimension outside his relationship with his mother, patient, kind, and devoted. Their daughter, Sophia, too, anchored her deeply. Amanda refused to let Mrs. Coker's cruelty be the reason her own child grew up without both parents under one roof. There was also, Amanda recognized honestly, a stubborn refusal to let Mrs. Coker win. A determination that if she left, it would feel like conceding a battle she never chose to fight in the first place, handing her mother-in-law exactly the victory she'd spent years working toward. So Amanda stayed, developing over time a kind of quiet, protective armor, learning to smile through the insults, to keep her responses measured and controlled, to build her own support system of friends and colleagues who reminded her regularly of her own worth outside of Mrs. Coker's narrow, cruel judgments. She threw herself into her career, eventually rising to a senior marketing director position, building a professional identity entirely separate from the family that had spent years trying to diminish her. She built, in other words, an entire life Mrs. Coker's cruelty could not touch, even as the cruelty itself never fully stopped. The deepest injury Mrs. Coker ever inflicted came during the hardest season of Amanda and Richard's marriage, the loss of a pregnancy in its 5th month, a daughter they had already begun, quietly, to call Ada in their private conversations. Amanda had been hospitalized for 3 days following the loss, physically weak and emotionally hollowed out in a way she would spend years learning to describe to anyone, even herself. Mrs. Coker visited the hospital on the 2nd day, and Amanda, still raw and desperate for any comfort at all, allowed herself to hope, briefly, that grief might finally soften the older woman. It did not. Standing at the foot of Amanda's hospital bed, Mrs. Coker had studied her with an expression Amanda would never fully forget. Not sympathy, but something closer to a confirmation of a suspicion she'd apparently held for years. Perhaps, Mrs. Coker said quietly, almost gently, which made the words land even harder. Perhaps this is the body's way of telling you something, Amanda. Not every woman is built to carry a Coker child successfully. It happened to my own sister-in-law, years ago. She never carried a healthy pregnancy either. Some women's bodies simply reject what doesn't belong to them. Amanda, too depleted to summon the anger the comment deserved, simply turned her face to the window and said nothing until Mrs. Coker eventually left. She told no one, not even Richard, what his mother had said that day, partly from exhaustion, partly from a bone-deep certainty that he would find some way to excuse it, the way he excused everything else. It was a wound Amanda carried silently for years afterward, resurfacing in quiet moments, during Sophia's birth 2 years later, during baby showers for friends, during any conversation that touched even lightly on pregnancy or loss. She built around that particular pain one of the sturdiest walls she ever constructed against her mother-in-law, a private vow that no matter what peace might eventually be brokered between them, that specific cruelty would never be forgiven, only endured and eventually outlived. The turning point came, unexpectedly, 9 years into Amanda and Richard's marriage, during a dinner celebrating Sophia's 8th birthday. Mrs. Coker, increasingly emboldened over the years by Richard's consistent silence, made a comment during the celebration that finally, decisively, broke through his passivity. Sophia had proudly shown her grandmother a school project, a simple, heartfelt drawing of their family, including both her parents standing together, hand in hand. Mrs. Coker said, examining the drawing with a faint, dismissive smile, "It's sweet that you drew your mother like that, Sophia. Though between us, I'm not sure how much longer that picture will stay accurate. Marriages like your parents rarely last in my experience. Your mother has always been difficult to truly love." Sophia, only 8 years old, looked up with visible confusion and hurt, unable to fully process what her grandmother meant, but sensing, in the way children always sense these things, that something cruel had just been said about her mother. Richard, watching his daughter's face crumble with confusion, finally reached the breaking point 9 years of accumulated grievances had been quietly building toward. "Mother,"
his voice carrying a firmness Amanda genuinely never had him use with his mother before. That is enough. That has always been enough, and I have let it go on far too long. What followed was a conversation 9 years overdue. Richard, for the first time in their entire marriage, laying out to his mother, calmly but unflinchingly, the full pattern of cruelty he had witnessed, and to his own growing shame, allowed to continue unchallenged for nearly a decade. I have watched you humiliate my wife at our own wedding, Richard said, his voice steady, despite his mother's visible shock at being confronted so directly. I have watched you undermine her as a mother in front of our own daughter. I have watched you try more than once to push other women toward me, as though Amanda was something disposable, rather than the woman I chose and continue to choose every single day. I told myself for years that staying quiet was keeping the peace. I understand now that it was cowardice. I was protecting my own comfort by sacrificing my wife's. Mrs. Coker, unaccustomed to any resistance from her son, attempted several familiar tactics: wounded indignation, accusations of ingratitude, reminders of every sacrifice she made raising him alone after his father's death. For the first time, none of it worked. I am grateful for everything you sacrificed raising me, Richard said. That gratitude does not extend to allowing you to spend the rest of my marriage trying to destroy it. From tonight forward, any disrespect toward Amanda will mean significantly less access to me and to your granddaughter. That is not a threat, Mother. That is simply the boundary I should have set 9 years ago. Amanda, listening to this conversation unfold, felt something in her chest loosen that had been tightly wound for nearly a decade. Not triumph exactly, but a profound overdue relief at finally being defended by the one person whose silence had hurt her most. The months following that dinner brought real, if imperfect, change. Mrs. Coker's visits grew less frequent, her comments when she did visit noticeably more restrained, though Amanda never fully believed the underlying resentment had disappeared, only that it had been forced into retreat by Richard's newly firm boundaries. Richard, for his part, seemed almost lighter, freed from a burden of divided loyalty he had carried, largely unconsciously, for their entire marriage. He began for the first time actively defending Amanda in real time rather than only apologizing after the fact, correcting his mother mid-conversation when old patterns resurfaced, ensuring Sophia understood clearly that her mother was loved and respected in their home regardless of what anyone else suggested. Amanda cautiously allowed herself to exhale for the first time in years. She did not fully trust the peace. 9 years of conditioning had taught her that Mrs. Coker's cruelty tended to resurface eventually in new forms when least expected. But for the first time, she had a husband standing visibly, unambiguously beside her when it did. She did not yet know how completely her mother-in-law's own choices, entirely separate from anything Amanda or Richard did, were about to bring the older woman's carefully maintained world crashing down around her. It would be tempting, looking back, to call what happened to Mrs. Coker bad luck, but Amanda, who had spent 9 years studying the woman's character with the forced attentiveness of someone perpetually bracing for the next attack, understood it differently. The same traits that had made Mrs. Coker so effective at cruelty, her need for control, her obsession with appearances, her refusal to ever appear vulnerable or in need of anyone's help were precisely the traits that left her exposed when trouble finally came. A woman more willing to ask for advice, more willing to admit uncertainty, might have questioned the investment opportunity more carefully, might have sought a second opinion on her declining health before it progressed to crisis. Mrs. Coker's downfall was not an accident visited upon her from outside. It grew, slowly and almost inevitably, from the same soil as everything else.
Mrs. Coker's downfall, when it came, arrived from directions entirely of her own making. Her financial situation, it emerged, over the following year, had been far more precarious than the family ever realized. Years of living beyond her means, funded substantially by a friend's investment opportunity that turned out to be a poorly disguised Ponzi scheme targeting older, socially prominent widows in her church community. When the scheme collapsed, as such schemes inevitably do, Mrs. Coker lost not only her own invested savings, but a significant portion of the equity in her home, which she had unwisely used as collateral to increase her investment. Simultaneously, her health began a steep, frightening decline. A long-neglected diabetes diagnosis, worsened by years of inconsistent management, progressing into complications that required expensive, ongoing medical care she could no longer afford following the financial collapse. Perhaps most devastatingly for Mrs. Coker, the social community she had spent decades cultivating, the church friends, the extended family members she had entertained lavishly for years, the social circle whose good opinion had always mattered more to her than almost anything else, largely evaporated once her financial troubles became apparent. The same friends she'd hosted at elaborate dinners for years suddenly found themselves too busy to visit, too preoccupied to return calls, unwilling to entangle themselves in a friend's financial and medical crisis, when the friendship itself, it turned out, had rarely run deeper than shared prosperity. Mrs. Coker, for the first time in her adult life, found herself genuinely, frighteningly alone, a proud woman whose entire sense of self had been built on control, superiority, and the careful curation of other people's opinions, now facing a crisis that no amount of manipulation could talk her way out of. The specifics, when they eventually emerged in full, painted an even more sobering picture than the initial rumors suggested. The investment opportunity had been introduced to her by a woman she'd known for over 15 years through her church's women's fellowship. A woman Mrs. Coker had trusted implicitly and even defended to skeptical friends, insisting the returns being promised were simply the reward of knowing the right people. By the time the scheme unraveled and its organizer disappeared entirely, taking with her the savings of nearly 30 families from the same small, tight-knit congregation, Mrs. Coker had lost not only her own investment, but a portion of a retirement fund she had, against her own better judgment, convinced 2 of her sisters to contribute as well. A betrayal within a betrayal that cost her not just money, but 2 of the few remaining family relationships she had left standing. The medical complications compounded the crisis in ways that felt, to Mrs. Coker, almost deliberately cruel in their timing. A diabetic foot ulcer that had gone unaddressed for months, partly from denial and partly from a determination not to appear weak in front of the same social circle whose opinion she'd spent decades cultivating, eventually requiring a hospital admission and a course of treatment whose costs, without the savings that had just evaporated, she had no realistic way to cover. The call came on a Tuesday evening, nearly 18 months after the confrontation at Sophia's birthday dinner. Amanda, now accustomed to a genuinely peaceful home life, was helping Sophia with homework when her phone rang, displaying a number she still, after 9 years, recognized instantly. She let it ring twice before answering, some old instinct of politeness overriding the part of her that already sensed what was coming. "Amanda," Mrs. Coker's voice said, thinner and less commanding than Amanda had ever heard it, carrying an unfamiliar tremor that might have been illness or might have been closer to fear. Amanda, her voice carefully neutral, informed her mother-in-law that Richard was currently at work and offered to have him call back once he returned. What followed was a halting, increasingly desperate conversation in which Mrs. Coker, clearly unaccustomed to asking anyone for anything, attempted several times to explain her situation without fully admitting its severity. Vague references to some difficulties, to needing temporary help, to hoping Amanda might understand and perhaps speak to Richard on her behalf. It was only when Amanda gently pressed for specifics that the full picture finally emerged. The lost savings, the medical bills accumulating faster than Mrs. Coker could manage, the home now at risk of foreclosure, the friends who had quietly disappeared, the genuine, frightening isolation Mrs. Coker now found herself facing entirely alone. "I know," Mrs. Coker said finally, her voice breaking in a way Amanda had genuinely never heard before. "I know I have not always been kind to you, Amanda, I know that. But you are family. Family helps family. I am asking you, please, to help me talk to Richard. I have nowhere else to turn."
Amanda sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment after the call ended. Sophia's homework still spread across the kitchen table. The ordinary evening around her feeling strangely suspended. She thought, in that quiet moment, about the wedding day toast that had humiliated her in front of 200 guests, about the years of quiet undermining as a mother, the comment to 8-year-old Sophia that had finally broken Richard's silence, the countless small cruelties accumulated over nearly a decade that Mrs. Coker had inflicted with the calm, deliberate confidence of a woman who never once imagined facing consequences for any of it. She thought, too, about the version of herself who might have felt obligated, even now, to rush to help. The version shaped by years of being told that a good woman forgives endlessly, that family obligation overrides personal history, that turning away from someone in genuine crisis, whatever they had done, made her somehow the villain of the story, rather than simply a woman finally choosing herself. Amanda rejected that framing deliberately and completely in that quiet kitchen, though not without a real, honest pull in the opposite direction first. For a long moment, sitting there with Sophia's homework spread across the table, Amanda felt something soften unexpectedly. An old habit of compassion that 9 years of hurt had never fully extinguished. She thought of Mrs. Coker's trembling voice on the phone, so unlike the commanding tone Amanda had spent nearly a decade bracing against, and some part of her, the part that still believed in mercy for its own sake, whispered that perhaps this was exactly the moment real grace was supposed to look like, helping the very person who least expected it, who had done the least to deserve it. She thought about Richard's own guilt if his mother's health worsened further while he had the means to help and hesitated. She thought uncomfortably about what kind of example she wanted to set for Sophia, whether teaching her daughter to build firm boundaries might, if carried too far, also teach her a harder kind of coldness Amanda didn't fully want to model either. She sat with that pull for the better part of an hour, turning it over honestly rather than dismissing it. In the end, it was not coldness that settled her decision, but clarity. Mercy freely chosen and mercy extracted through guilt were not the same thing. And 9 years of Mrs. Coker weaponizing exactly that confusion had taught Amanda to tell the difference. Helping now, in this specific crisis, would not undo 9 years of cruelty. It would simply confirm once more that there had never been any real cost to inflicting it. When Richard came home that evening, Amanda told him about his mother's call, relaying the full situation honestly and without embellishment. Richard listened carefully, his expression unreadable for a long moment before he finally spoke. "What do you want to do?" he asked her. A question that itself represented the full distance they had traveled since the early years of their marriage, when Amanda's wishes regarding her mother were rarely meaningfully consulted at all. "I'm not going to help her," Amanda said simply. "I'm not going to be cruel about it. I won't celebrate her suffering, and I won't stand in your way if you choose to help her yourself, because she's your mother and that's genuinely your decision to make. But I am not going to be the one who rescues a woman who spent 9 years trying to convince you I wasn't worth keeping. I've earned the right to let this be her consequence, not my burden." Richard's own response to his mother's crisis unfolded with a complexity that surprised even Amanda. He did not, in the end, cut his mother off entirely, visiting her occasionally, ensuring through his own more limited means that her most urgent medical needs were addressed, maintaining the basic thread of a relationship that 9 years of cruelty toward his wife had strained but not entirely severed. But he did something else too, something that marked the final, decisive completion of the reckoning that had begun at Sophia's 8th birthday dinner. He refused, clearly and without ambiguity, to ask Amanda to participate in his mother's rescue in any capacity. And he refused to allow his mother, even in her genuine distress, to manipulate the situation into a narrative where Amanda's refusal to help constitutes some new failing to be resented. "My wife owes you nothing, mother," he told her plainly during one of his visits when Mrs. Coker attempted, even amid her crisis, to suggest that Amanda's absence from the situation reflected poorly on her character. "You spent years teaching me to doubt her value. I spent years failing to correct you. The debt in this relationship has never run in the direction you seem to believe it has." Mrs. Coker, forced by circumstance into a confrontation with consequences she had spent her entire life avoiding, found no path forward that allowed her to maintain the narrative of victimhood she instinctively reached for. Her son would help her, within his own limits, out of his own enduring love for her, despite everything. But the daughter-in-law she had spent 9 years trying to destroy would not be riding to her rescue, and no amount of appeal to family obligation would change that fact.
In the months that followed, Amanda did not spend her energy monitoring her mother-in-law's ongoing struggles, did not check in on the situation's progress, did not allow the crisis unfolding at the margins of her life to become the center of her attention, the way Mrs. Coker's cruelty once had, for years, occupied far more of Amanda's emotional energy than any reasonable person should have had to give. Instead, she poured herself into the life she and Richard had, at long last, genuinely built together, a marriage now operating with the kind of honest, unified partnership that 9 years of divided loyalty had prevented. She watched Sophia grow, secure and confident in a household where both parents' love for her and for each other was no longer complicated by an outside campaign of undermining. Amanda's career continued its upward trajectory, eventually earning her a promotion to Chief Marketing Officer at her firm, a professional identity built entirely on her own merit, entirely separate from the family that had spent nearly a decade suggesting she wasn't good enough to deserve any of it.
She found in the space that Mrs. Coker's absence from her daily concerns created a peace she had almost forgotten was possible. The simple, ordinary experience of a life not constantly bracing for the next cruelty, the next undermining comment, the next quiet campaign to convince her husband she wasn't worth keeping. Nearly 2 years after that Tuesday evening phone call, Amanda encountered her mother-in-law one final time at a small family gathering Richard had arranged, cautiously, to allow some limited reconnection between his mother and his immediate family, largely for Sophia's sake. Mrs. Coker, visibly humbled by the intervening years, her health stabilized but permanently altered by the diabetes complications, her finances rebuilt only partially and modestly through her own careful, chastened efforts, rather than any rescue that never materialized, approached Amanda near the end of the evening with something Amanda had genuinely never witnessed from the woman before: unguarded vulnerability. Mrs. Coker said quietly, her voice carrying none of its old commanding certainty, "I understand why you didn't help me, Amanda. I have had a great deal of time to think about the woman I was to you, Amanda. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I don't believe I have earned it. I only wanted you to know that I understand finally exactly what I built and exactly why it collapsed the way it did." Amanda considered her mother-in-law for a long moment, not with the old, exhausted weariness of 9 years defending herself, but with the calm clarity of a woman who had, at genuine cost, finally found solid ground beneath her own feet. "I appreciate you saying that," Amanda said. "I'm not interested in punishing you further, and I hope your health continues to improve. But I also won't pretend the last 9 years didn't happen, or that a difficult season in your life erases them. We can coexist peacefully for Richard's sake and for Sophia's. That's what I'm able to offer. I hope that's enough." It was not the reconciliation a more sentimental story might have offered, but it was, Amanda understood clearly, exactly the kind of ending that belonged to the story she had actually lived. Not cruelty repaid with cruelty, but boundaries finally, fully respected on terms Amanda herself had earned the right to set.
Mrs. Patience Coker spent 9 years believing her son's love for her should always outweigh his wife's right to basic respect. And she spent those same 9 years building a life on control, superiority, and other people's fear of her disapproval. When that life finally collapsed under the weight of her own choices, she discovered that the daughter-in-law she'd spent nearly a decade trying to destroy had at last learned the one lesson Mrs. Coker herself had never taught her on purpose: that some people do not deserve automatic rescue simply because they share your family's name. Grace is a gift you are free to give. It was never a debt anyone was entitled to collect.